Hi everybody, Professor King here. Today in this video, I'm going to be talking about Freud's Uncanny, and that should segue us into considering Hawthorne's Young Goodman Brown. So without further ado, I take it to the share screen and we dive right into Freud. All right, so this is a selection from, some of Freud's theory. This is Freud's theory on the uncanny. But before we talk about this text, we have to get a little bit of background in terms of psychoanalytic criticism, because that's the type of criticism we're looking at today when applied to literature. It's usually called psychoanalytic criticism, psychoanalytic theory, or psychoanalysis. So what is psychoanalytic criticism? Well, these definitions come from an introductory theory textbook by a gentleman by the last name of Barry. These are not from our Norton textbook. These are just general definitions that I'm providing for you that will help to contextualize what we're seeing in Freud. So Barry states that psychoanalytic criticism involves investigating the interaction of conscious and unconscious elements in the mind. Well, what do we mean by conscious and unconscious? Well, if anyone has any background on Freud, the conscious is kind of our living daily reality, right? The stuff that we experience as soon as we wake up until we go to sleep. And then the unconscious is stuff that's either kind of going on in the back of our mind without our knowledge, or things like in our dreams or our imagination, right? So that's what we're looking at with psychoanalytic theory, is the interaction between those two, kind of our waking consciousness and the things that are embedded in our subconscious. So the other thing that psychoanalytic criticism involves is an attribution of sexual connotations to explain anxieties surrounding repression. Okay, so that's what this kind of image here is all about. So when we talk about sexuality, Freud was obsessed with sex, right? We're talking about what it has to do with our daily lives. But if we think about Western culture, right? Western culture has a lot of qualms and a lot of anxiety and a lot of discomfort around the discussion of sexuality. So sometimes that experience of sexuality, and it can be very varied, our experiences of sexuality, they get repressed, meaning they get kind of shoved down, right, into our subconscious, right, into our internal selves, because we don't have that chance to just sort of like be animals, right? Like, I'm sure you've all gone to like a dog park and see what happens there. They're not worried about repressing their sexuality, so they just like run wild, right? But we as civilized humans, we care, so we repress that, and when we repress it, right, it's got to go somewhere, according to Freud. And where does it go? Well, it gets sort of sublimated into these other arenas, right? I'm sure you all have heard the term phallic symbol, right? Like something that is shaped like or suggesting of male genitalia. That comes directly from Freud, right? And so these are the kinds of things that we're talking about when we're talking about repression, right? Like, we don't talk about it, we push it down, but it's like sweeping stuff under the rug. It eventually comes out and rears its ugly head in some way eventually. All right, and then the third part is kind of segueing into what I just talked about, which is this notion of the return of that which is repressed, right? The stuff we try to repress comes back. But it's not like we just say it or we make it explicit, because we can't in our society, right? It has to come out through symbolic or abstract means, right? Like the phallic symbol. You can't do, someone wouldn't just like kind of pull their pants down and go, here it is, right? Or just start talking about their genitalia. I mean, some people do, but not in polite company. So they have to find other ways to sort of get that out, right? Another kind of contemporary one is like the raised truck syndrome, right? Like whenever you see someone with like a big, loud, you know, truck with 36-inch rims and whatever else, the joke is like the immediate thought is like, that guy has small genitals, right? So that's where a lot of this discussion comes from. It really, you know, it's still, there's ways in which, most of the ways psychoanalytic theory in terms of the field of psychology is concerned, it doesn't hold water anymore, like because it's theory and it's been, you know, disproven through data and statistics, but it's still fun to consider in terms of, you know, like comedy, or in terms of literary symbolism, or in terms of, again, like just thinking about culture and our culture's continued discomfort around sexuality, right? Sorry, that's my dog. He's uncomfortable about sexuality, so he's telling me like, don't talk about this, Mom. Too bad, Lionel. We're talking Freud. That's right. He'll keep whining. I might have to feed him a snack in a moment. Ultimately, critics of psychoanalytic theory say that it's sexist and racist, and here's why. Freud's a German guy living, you know, at the turn of the 19th to 20th century. Again, not all of his practices were totally data driven. You know, he did things like use male subjects and, you know, attribute the results to women. He also was pretty unethical with some of his clientele. He had a very limited pool of people, which were wealthy European women, a very small group of them. So, you know, there's the sexism part, and then the racism part is also a byproduct of that, which is, you know, again, wealthy white people didn't really, this is when I get my dog a snack, didn't really involve any discussions of people of color, of people from a variety of class strata. Just so you know, I'm not lying. There he is. He's happy now. He got a snack. So that's why it's kind of called, and Freud says some pretty racist things, right? He's a product of his time in so many ways, which doesn't excuse any of the things that he says, but it does put it into context for us so that we can now, today, and people have done this, many theorists have done this, we can take out, right, the unsavory stuff, and we can sort of inject a feminist lens, or we can inject a critical race or a post-colonial lens to some of his stuff. And that's what a lot of people have done. People will be reading like Laura Mulvey, Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, even Toni Morrison and Bell Hooks to an extent, like they've done this stuff. So that's why we acknowledge the problems and we build upon them to fix them, essentially. Anyway, that's a conversation for another day. Let's keep talking Freud and the uncanny. So now we're getting into the text. Some of you in your 100 classes, I'm just gonna hold his collar because he's being a brat. Some of you in your 100 classes may have read the text, They Say, I Say. So if this is familiar to you, good. If not, I'll kind of give a brief explanation. So in They Say, I Say, you know, for those of you who don't feel like reading it, here's the bottom line. One thing that all writers do, and this is why we research, one of the reasons why we research, is writers engage in a conversation. And so if it's a conversation, we didn't start it, right? It's been going on for centuries, if not millennia. So all of our arguments are responding to someone or something else. That's the they say, is the arguments that came before us. Then the I say is our argument, right? Our response to the conversation that's already been going on, okay? So we'll start with the they says, or what we call the premises, right? And a premise is the given that the writer and the audience have to share in order to move on to the argument. In other words, like, you know, if I just say, I'm going to call my mom. You might say, cool, I don't care, whatever, right? But if I say, oh, it's raining and I don't want to sit in the rain, so I'm going to call my mom to give me a ride. The it's raining and I don't want to sit in the rain are the premises that lead us to the argument, okay? Freud gives us a ton of definitions as premises. He wants to make sure, and this is very common when we talk about things like arguments of definition. He wants to make sure that we're on the same page, that when he's talking about a certain term, one, we as the audience know what he means, and two, we know the parameters of that, so that when he says unheimlich, we go, oh, he's talking about X, Y, and Z, right? So the first thing we need to know about the uncanny is that it's the familiar, unfamiliar. That's kind of the broad definition of the term, right? The uncanny is the familiar, unfamiliar. The unheimlich and all of the ambiguous definitions that Freud provides us. And just as a way to remember this, the familiar, unfamiliar. So what do we think of as familiar? Well, we think of home as familiar, right? Hopefully. Some of us, I remember one year I moved 8 times in a year, so home wasn't always very familiar for me, but most of us probably have a home that's familiar to us, and it brings us comfort, or it lets us rest, or whatever else, right? So all those connotations that go along with home, Freud is injecting that into this notion of the familiar, right? If you think about the word Anaheim is a very strange multilingual portmanteau. It actually comes from Spanish, Ana, from Santa Ana, St. Anne, and then Heim, German, which is home, as we now know from Freud. And just a little background, the reason why Anaheim is called Anaheim or Anaheim is it's the home of St. Anne. St. Anne was kind of the patron saint of this area. And back in its founding in the mid-19th century, and a little bit further on, kind of towards the beginning of the 20th century, you had a large population of German immigrants and Mexican settlers, right? People of Mexican descent living in this area. So what they decided to do when they incorporated the town was to call it the home of Anne, but to bring in both those languages to do so. So that's why it's called Anaheim. So that might help you remember that term unheimlich, right? The home, right? But in terms of that means right? Not, it's the same as in English. So it's not home, right? So the familiar, that's where the unfamiliar comes in, right? The not hominess of that which we find familiar, the discomforting aspects of that which we've typically normally seen as familiar. And Freud goes into all these, sorry, my other dog's barking, I gotta go grab her. Freud brings us all these definitions, right? He talks about the Sandman story. He talks about that like girl doll automaton thing. He talks about seizures, right? And how like a seizure, we see the person that we've always seen, but if they're having a seizure, they're reacting, or they're moving in a way that they can't control, that's unfamiliar to us. And that's what scares us, right? Is that it's someone we know, someone that's familiar, but their body movements are happening in a way that's so unfamiliar to us. The dancing severed hand in the story, right? Like all of these are examples of the familiar, unfamiliar. And what effect does that have on us? Well, it renders us feeling a lot of different ways. Probably scared, shocked, surprised, frightened, helpless, especially if it's just sort of in front of us and we're not expecting it, we can't do anything about it. But also we have to reconcile that with all the things that familiarity brings us. Happiness, joy. I know the old adage is that it breeds contempt, but sort of like we don't even think about it, right? So those two things are clashing. They're in conflict with one another. And so where does sex come into all this? Because Freud's got to bring it back to sex. He's Freud. That's what he's going to do. Well, he brings in the castration complex, another definition that he wants us to know, right? Which is how uncanny objects symbolize vulnerability. But that's not enough because it's Freud. It's not just our emotional vulnerability, right? Our sort of mutability, as Wordsworth would say, right? It's our sexual vulnerability, right? Of perhaps being castrated. And to Freud, being castrated means being made impotent, right? Being made unable to do certain things, being unable to have agency. And we've talked about agency in previous videos. So, if we think about this in terms of, let's say, Nietzsche, right? Nietzsche talks about these metaphors and these symbols and how nothing is familiar, right? Everything is external and we've applied the familiar to it. Freud's going a step further and saying the things that we've made familiar to ourselves are then once again made unfamiliar in some freak way, and it throws us for a loop, particularly when it comes to sex. All right. Whoop. All right. I'm going to move my screen here so you can see all the stuff. So here are some quotes that we need to know from Freud, because now he's getting into his I say, which is we've set up the premises, we know what page we're on, we're responding to previous works that he's looking at, like all those myths and works of literature and other theorists and things. But now he's saying, here's where I come in. And so here are a couple of quotes to think about where he comes in, right? First off, right, the uncanny, the unheimlich, is something which is secretly familiar, which has undergone repression and then returned from it. Okay, so we have familiar, we have repression, and then again we have coming back up, right? And that's what leads to these mixed feelings of comfort and familiarity and repulsion and fear. Okay, again, if you see your friend experiencing a seizure, it's going to make you feel scared, right? You see your friend, that brings you comfort, but at the same time, you see them in a situation which makes you feel scared and helpless. And it's those mixed feelings that provide the uncanny, right? Or you see someone, like a less sort of intense example, you see somebody on the street. I'll give you an example. Like my father passed away a year ago. And after he died, I'm not kidding, I saw, not middle-aged, he was older, but beyond middle-aged men on the street all the time. And it stopped me in my tracks because they looked exactly like him. And it started happening all the time. It was like the weirdest thing, right? And it made me feel those feelings, right? It made me feel like, oh, is that Dad? No, that can't be because he passed away, right? So it was those feelings of like familiarity, but also fear. Like, why am I seeing my dad if he's dead in physical form, right? So that's another example. I guess that is kind of morbid. I tried to think of a less morbid example, but look who you're talking to. All right, let's go on. An uncanny experience occurs either when infantile complexes which have been repressed are once more revived by some impression, or when primitive beliefs which have been surmounted seem once more to be confirmed. This is where Freud starts to get a little borderline racist, right? That word primitive. Essentially what he's saying, and when he says infantile complexes, again, he's talking about sex, because in other works of his, he goes on at length about like how children are, obsessed with their sex organs, and then society kind of beats that out of them. And so it has to be repressed somewhere, right? But the primitive beliefs, right, is kind of this idea that like at one time when we were savages, right, or primitive, or what Freud would say uncivilized, right, which is hooey, that we were able to kind of live more freely. A very cliched literary and theoretical trope, but one that's still used nonetheless, right? So an uncanny experience occurs when those things have been repressed, again, shoved down, once more revived by some impression, or when they've been surmounted and then again confirmed. So if you watch, like, if you've ever seen Apocalypse Now or read Heart of Darkness, off of which it's loosely based, you know, when Kurtz is first introduced, it's called Kurtz in both, and he's got like the gnarly like face, and he looks really freaky, right? And he's living among the natives, another racist trope, right? That's an example of that second thing we're talking about, right? Where someone who is from Western culture, and you would think to see him in like a general's uniform, and this is what the Marlowe thinks he's going to see, right? Instead comes out and he's in like, you know, he's for lack of a better term, and I'm not using this term, I'm putting it in quotations, he's gone native, right? Like, and we have to sort of think about, and now's maybe a good time to pause and think about that, right? Like, what about non-Western cultures has been rendered scary to us, and why? Said, when we get to Said will talk more about this, right? How non-Western cultures have been exoticized and have been made to seem over-sexualized or violent or scary, you know? And so why? You know, like, what historically for Westerners has been the big scare, right? And that's something when you think about Freud that you can critique. Because hopefully now in 2020, being enlightened, we can realize that there's nothing about other cultures that are particularly, you know, more or less scary than our own. So why do we have to apply that sort of fear? Something to think about. Anyway, let's move on. Okay, an uncanny effect is produced when the distinction between imagination and reality is effaced, meaning like scrubbed or wiped away. When a symbol takes over the full function of the thing it symbolizes. Again, if we think back to Nietzsche, right? The symbol taking over the function of the thing it symbolizes. That is straight from Nietzsche, if we think about that. But imagination and reality is effaced. In other words, the stuff we can think up in our imagination, like the devil or a unicorn, well, maybe not a unicorn because that's not scary, but you know, Cthulhu or something like that, right? If that were to like appear in front of us and we didn't know what to do with it because the stuff that we thought lived here is now in front of us, right? That creates an uncanny effect. And finally, in literature, in the last kind of 2.5 pages, Freud goes into how this all plays out in literature. And ultimately, right, what he says is it's realism or realistic fiction as opposed to fantasy that brings about a sense of the uncanny. And I want to refer back to something he says, because it in the second edition on page 828, right before section 2, Freud says, he references Klinger, Frederick von Klinger, and this is very important, and I wonder if any Game of Thrones fans notice this. He says, at times I feel like a man who walks in the night and believes in ghosts. Every corner is Heimlich and full of terrors for him. Okay? So that goes, if we think of Game of Thrones, right? The night is dark and full of terrors. Now you know where it came from. If not Freud, then Klinger, right? So thinking about Game of Thrones, this is how this idea of like realism works. Because if we think about Game of Thrones, this fantasy world where there's dragons and, again, lots of genitalia, and things that should exist in that fantasy world, if we see, you know, a giant or a troll or a guy come back from the dead, it's not surprising for us because the whole world is imaginative, right? All of Essos and Westeros is imagined, right? It's fantasy. That's the genre. But if a dragon were to appear in, you know, like, you know, a Kate Hudson movie, like if all of a sudden in How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days, like she has a pet dragon, you'd be like, what's going on? Like this takes place in New York, right? Like what? So in other words, like in fantasy fiction, in those genres, we expect, right, the weird to come out. But if we're reading realistic fiction that's supposed to take place in the real world and something uncanny happens in literature, that's when we go, huh, I wonder what that's all about. And we think about the significance of, again, that effacing of imagination reality within the context of that literary text. Why, right? And that kind of brings us to, I think, that brings us to thinking about this in terms of young Goodman Brown, right? If any of you read The Scarlet Letter in high school, give it another try, first of all. I know you all hated it then, but maybe a few years later, you know, a little bit of breathing space, you might like it a little more. But either way, you know Hawthorne really loves him some Puritans, right? Hawthorne's writing in the mid-19th century, but he's always going back to, you know, the 17th century Puritan New England setting to set his stories. Some of his other works don't, right? Like Dr. Rappaccini's Daughter or whatever, but a lot of his work has to do with 17th century New England Puritanism. Scarlet Letter is a great example. Young Goodman Brown, another example of that, okay? So the first question maybe is, why is a guy in the 19th century, you know, 200 years after the fact, why is he writing about the Puritans? That would be like somebody today writing about something that happened in Nathaniel Hawthorne's time. Why is he using that to tell us a story, okay? And also, like, if that's the case, right, we know certain things are going to be brought up, right? We know that, like, if these are, like, settler, colonizer, European Puritans, right, we know religion's going to play a role because that's one of the main reasons that they were there in the first place. We know the setting is probably going to play a role. If anyone's ever seen the film The Witch kind of plays with similar setting and themes, right? Like the sort of intense, the uncanny, but also like the intense setting of New England to people of, you know, extreme religious persuasion. You know, so we know we got religion, we know we got New England, we know we got wilderness. So let's start thinking about this in terms of the uncanny, right? So first off, when you think about Young Goodman Brown, review your notes of the uncanny, okay? Then read Young Goodman Brown. And, you know, if it's challenging because it's written in an older language, read it again. You got time. We got nothing but time right now, right? Take notes, again, highlight, annotate, ask questions, all that good stuff. And then once you've read both, create a bifurcated list like you see here. This is not really a list because there's only one item on the list. But if it had more elements and parallels, it would be a list. And jot down elements of the uncanny as Freud mentions them in the essay, and then apply those notions to passages from Young Goodman Brown, right? Where do you see phallic symbols? Where do you see repression? Where do you see the slippage of the imaginative into reality? Where do you see the uncanny, right? Where do you see that mingling of the familiar and the frighteningly, fearfully unfamiliar, right? Go on and on and on and on and on. Think of all the stuff, right? All the things. And then slow down. Don't speed up. Everyone thinks they got to speed up in an English class, in a reading class, in a writing class. Slow down. Contemplate, right? Go for a walk. That's what I always like to do. I go for walks and I start talking to myself because I'm a weirdo in my head, sometimes out loud. Doesn't really matter. And think of what you come up with. Why is what you're noticing important? What does it all mean? Am I some sort of creep, degenerate, or pervert for noticing these things? Well, the answer is no to that last one. But for the other two, right, like, what's Hawthorne getting at? And if we look at this through the lens of Freud, how can we read this differently with a psychoanalytic lens? So again, let it marinate. I'm going to take it off share screen now. Let it marinate. Enjoy it. Struggle, grapple. You don't have to be perfect. Just have some ideas, right? And if anything comes up, always feel free to message me, to contact me, and have a great rest of your day and night. I'll see you in cyberspace. Bye.